Okay, so
Right.
welcome to this discussion group. I think we'll make a start now. Today we're lucky enough to have Carlo and Joar. Joar studies computer science and philosophy at Hartford. Carlo studies maths and philosophy at Hartford, and they're both in fourth year. So can you tell us what you're going to be talking about?
Yeah, so today we will be talking about long-termism, which is a view in, I suppose, practical ethics, which says, roughly speaking, that almost all moral value is in the far future, and that concerns about very long-term effects of our actions should be, in many cases, the main guiding principle behind our actions. And in particular, that we have an overwhelming moral obligation to reduce threats to the survival of the human species. Shall I just keep going?
Yeah, go on.
Okay. So, what could possibly motivate this view? It is a bit surprising and unusual at face value. So, let us basically try to estimate how many people or how much potential moral value could exist in the future. So, starting with a lower bound, we know that the Earth will be inhabitable for roughly another billion years. And if we just assume that humanity could stay alive on Earth until it becomes uninhabitable, with just our current population levels and roughly our current levels of prosperity, then this means that the future would contain roughly 10 to the 15 human beings. So for comparison, 10 to the 11 is roughly the number of humans that have existed so far throughout all of history. But this is in many ways an unrealistically conservative estimate, because probably, if everything goes well, humanity will not just stay on Earth. So if we take into account the possibility of colonizing more of space, this number becomes even more impressive. So because of the fact that the speed of light is finite and the fact that the universe expands, we couldn't actually, even in principle, reach all of the visible universe. However, just with technologies that could probably realistically be developed given enough time, we could reach something like, I think, 10 to the 18 stars. And if we suppose, which is quite modest, again, that 10% of those could support 1 billion humans for 1 billion years, then this gives us 10 to the 33 potential human lives in the future. And again, this is in many ways a conservative estimate because it doesn't take into account any potential technologies for enabling larger populations and so on. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail here, but depending on what assumptions you make, you could end up with as many as roughly 10 to the 70 humans in the future. But let's stick with the 10 to the 33 figure for now, because I think it's a realistic lower bound. How big is this number? I want to give you an intuition for this. 10 to the 33 human lives. How much, roughly, do you think that 10 to the 33 hours might be? Well, let's make a little thought experiment. Let's say that you stand on the equator of the Earth, and then you wait a year, and at the end of this year, you take one step. And then you wait another year, and you take one step. And you keep going like this until you have walked around the entire planet one step at a time. And when you have done this, you take a glass and remove one glass of water from the ocean. And then you take a step again, and you keep going until you've walked around the entire planet 1 meter every year. And then you take another glass. And then you keep going until you have completely emptied all oceans on the Earth of water. And when you have completed this task in this way, the amount of hours this will have taken you is roughly 10 to the 32, which means that if you do that entire thing another 9 times, the amount of hours that will have taken is comparable to the amount of human lives that will, as a realistic lower bound, probably exist in the future. So, as I'm sure is probably coming across, this is a truly astronomical number. This is a number that the human brain is probably biologically not capable of fully comprehending. So now, with this in mind, I want to give you a question. Let's say that 2 events were to happen. The first event is that 99% of all humans in existence now die. And the second event is that the final 1% of all humans die. Now, my question to you is, of these 2 events, which event is much, much worse? Anyone has any opinion?
I have an opinion. I think the second one is worse.
Yes, I agree with Carlo. Because in the second event, the people that you lose is not just the final 1% of all humans, but you also lose all humans in the future. So instead of having this grand future for the universe, where most of the universe is full of potentially happy human lives, you just have a bunch of dead matter and energy being converted into heat without anything interesting happening, which would be, in a literal sense, a truly astronomical loss of human life. So, extinction for the human species would be a very, very bad thing. So bad that our brains can't fully comprehend it. And unfortunately, the extinction of the human species is something that is realistically possible. So to take an example that I'm sure is familiar to everyone here, consider nuclear weapons. Russia and the United States individually have enough nuclear weapons to eradicate all life on the planet many times over. Which means that, for example, if some not very sensible administration were to come into control of this arsenal, that potentially puts the entire future of the universe at stake. And this also leads us on to a second point. Throughout most of human history, this has not been the case. So let's take a very powerful person from the past, Charlemagne, king of the Franks, king of all of Western Europe, one of the most powerful persons to be alive at his time, and probably even would have been very powerful compared to people alive now. Would he have been able to destroy the human species? And the answer is no, because for all of his power, he just controlled a little bit of Western Europe. And if he tried to carry out some kind of comprehensive genocide, he would just be toppled very quickly. But now, governments and a fairly small number of individuals are toying with things like nuclear weapons or things like extreme climate change, which actually do put these things at stake. And moreover, if we look to the future, if everything goes well, probably this risk will, in not too long, no longer exist. So if we suppose that humanity indeed manages to colonize more of the universe, say that humanity spreads out over a few galaxies, say, then even if there is some kind of mega catastrophe in one solar system, or even a local star cluster, that wouldn't threaten the survival of the human species as a whole on the scale of a galaxy or a cluster of galaxies. Which means that probably we live in a very special and in many ways actually quite narrow and unusual period of human history. We live after the invention of technologies that could destroy the human species, but before the human species was robust enough to be able to survive any kind of catastrophe. This means that we are in the narrow period of history in which the future of the universe was at stake. This means that we have an immense, overwhelming, by human brains not comprehensible moral responsibility to ensure the survival of the human species. I mean, just for the sake of it, let's do a simple calculation. Let's start with the very unrealistically conservative lower bound of 10 to the 15 human lives in the future. And let's say that you could somehow take an action that would reduce the risk of extinction by 1/1,000,000 of 1%. Well, if you multiply those numbers, you get that the value of this action is equivalent to roughly 100 million human lives. It's completely mind-boggling. And so if we accept this, what does that recommend in terms of practical actions? For this, I will hand over the scene to Carlo.
Yeah, so thanks, Joar. In terms of practical actions, because you only have to mitigate the likelihood by a insignificant amount, right, by a millionth, and you've saved 100 million people. Because of that, and because extinction risks are so under prioritized, basically anything you do is quite good. Like, once you've accepted the kind of force of the argument, and you just say like, well, what do I have a comparative advantage in? Like, what are my skills? And then you could think, well, how could I apply these skills in reducing the likelihood of extinction? That's probably going to be good enough. So there are kind of policies that could be recommended at humanities as a whole, but on an individual level, it's a lot easier, I suppose.
Yeah,
because you have this extra constraint of what you can do. So
this is another very relevant thing to keep in mind. How many people do you think are currently working explicitly on the problem of reducing the risk of an existential catastrophe? Well, it's in the hundreds. It's not very much. So any amount of work that is added onto solving this problem has an actual significant marginal contribution. So again, to Carlo, do you have any concrete examples of potential existential risks beyond nuclear weapons?
So throughout the 20th century, nuclear weapons were probably the main one. So on most accounts, the precipice, right, that is the period of human history in which we have the potential to destroy it. That precipice started in 1945, right? But the general consensus of people who studied this is that in the coming century, there are going to be other anthropomorphic risks, which might even outweigh the risk of nuclear war. Well, three of them are badly designed artificial intelligence, genetically engineered pandemics, and badly engineered nanobots. Now, there's not a lot. Not many people are working on saving us from nanobots, because the defense strategies there are going to be very dependent on what these specific things look like. Whereas as with the pandemic, with the AI risk,
well, I think with
whatever,
pandemics, there's also a lot of general things you can do. But yeah, go on.
Yeah, with the AI risk, whatever it looks like, there are like specific problems that you're going to have to solve, and these are like very difficult problems. So that's why people are like, putting a lot of work into solving them now, because we know that we're going to have to solve them.
Yeah.
I don't know much about the pandemics and the nanobots.
I mean, I guess this is something we can get more into in the discussion, but I think that this concludes the basic case for long-termism. So first of all, the future is potentially extremely bad.
Can I just add that we've argued that value lies in the future because like happy, joyous human experience is what we value, and there's quintillions more of that in the future. But it doesn't. That's not a necessary assumption for the argument. If you think about what you personally value, right, and you list a bunch of things that you value, I get like most of those things are going to require for their existence flourishing human life. So if you value art or science or I don't know, friendship and love, whatever you write down, it's going to require flourishing human life.
Yeah. So I mean, even if you care about something as banal as like whatever reruns of your favorite TV show, well, probably there will be a lot more of that if the future goes as it should. So this is also surprisingly invariant under
values.
Yeah.
So if you don't agree precisely with how we've measured value, think how you might measure value and see whether the argument still works or doesn't work. I would think about that first. So I think that concludes the preliminary.
Yeah, I think that
that's the case, and then we can hear some.
Cool. Joar, did you want to give like a very, very brief outline of the entire argument just before we go into the discussion?
Yeah, so as an outline for the entire argument, it's something like when taking actions, you should be sensitive to the scale of what they might do. So something like helping one person is good, helping 100 people is even better, helping 10 to the 33 people is very, very good. And with this in mind, we can look at, well, where in the lifespan of the universe is there a lot of people that we could potentially affect positively with our actions? Well, turns out to be the future, because, well, there is just such a humongous amount of resources and time in the future that is not used up in the present. So we get something like, realistically could imagine 10 to the 33 humans in the future. That is probably an underestimate. And then moreover, so this means that we have the moral value of the future is very large. And then moreover, the future is not guaranteed to happen, because we live in a time in which it is possible for the human species to go extinct, and this time will not last forever, which means that we who are alive now have an extreme moral obligation to reduce those threats.
Great, thanks Joar and Carlo. Do we have any questions before I just jump into one of mine? Would anyone like to say anything? Maybe type in the chat so it's obvious, or like wave or something. Felix?
Yeah, I've got a question. So if the most important, what this worries, what the long-termist argument worries, what worries me about it is the way that it is used to justify things which have bad effects over the short term and very positive effects over the long term. So my example might be, if we look back to, say, like classical Athens, right? Athenian democracy, and we've got Socrates and Aristotle and all these people running about. And that Athenian golden age is made possible by the colonization of the whole Aegean. And you've got stuff like the Siege of Melos, where the Athenians essentially kill an entire island's worth of people because they can and because they want them to pay tribute. And my question is, from my perspective, 2,500 years later, what should I be glad that happened? That this, like, under many philosophical moral systems, evil act of sacking Melos, but that was a kind of necessary condition for the flourishing of Socrates and Aristotle, and that is the disutility of the short term worth the fact that Socrates and Aristotle continue to bring us some measure of positive utility over the next thousands, if not millions of years. And how could that? And if you then think about that, I mean, my life is better because that happened. Would be my contention. But I'm a bit worried about what happens when you bring that into the present day.
Yeah, so I think this is basically the question: is the trade-off between consequentialist thinking and deontological thinking.
When you have no discount rate.
Yeah. So is it worth sacrificing people for the greater good? Is one way maybe to put the question. And I want to stress that I don't think we have those kinds of dilemmas in this case, because we don't have to really hurt anyone presently living to reduce existential threats. Now, one thing which this does entail is that if you, say, want to decide what to do with, so let's suppose that someone is deciding what to do with their career, and that their main concern is how to do good. And I will assume that it's better to do more good. For now, I will remain neutral or suspend judgment on the question of whether it's worth doing harm for greater good, because I don't think that is really a crucial assumption in this argument. Then, yeah, so going back, sorry, that if we have someone who decides what to do with their career, then the long-termist position does say that it would be better to work on reducing the risk of nuclear war than to work on other social issues. So that is entailed by the view. However, the view does not entail that you should actively cause harm to people to save the future. If not else, because I simply don't think that the world as it currently looks presents us with those kinds of trade-offs.
Well, I don't see why you need long-termism to justify that in that case. I don't see why you need to make this calculus of like 100 million lives now is worth a point whatever reduction in existential risk. But like, nobody's saying that it's a bad thing to devote your career to reducing like the incidence of pandemics. Yeah. But when you're saying we should reduce the incidence of pandemics at the cost of all these present things now, that's when like the kind of calculus you want to make starts becoming relevant.
Yeah, so I think here, so in moral philosophy, one will sometimes distinguish between sort of causing something to happen and allowing something to happen, or at least in the ontological system, this makes sense. In consequentialist systems, you don't really make that assumption. So what I am saying is that, yes, this view does tell you to prioritize saving the future over causing good things to happen in the present. So in that sense, it tells you to potentially allow bad things to happen in the present. However, it doesn't tell you to cause bad things to happen in the present. I don't know of any realistic situation in which something like that would happen.
What
Which
about,
means
for
that-
example,
Well,
shutting down
so
the fossil fuels industry, which is going to cause all sorts of people to lose their job?
Yeah,
I mean, that seems like a good thing. That thing's like, in the short term, the next year, 2 years, that is a net bad thing.
yeah. So potentially, so if you had some action that would kill the fossil fuel industry, maybe that would be an example of this. But I think even there, if you have a fairly short time horizon, probably more jobs would be created in, the renewable energies industries and so on and so forth.
It's not like a preposterous idea.
No, but if such a, so I mean, I am generally more compelled by the consequentialist ways of reasoning, which tells you essentially to not distinguish between causing things to happen and letting things happen and so on. But I think that in practice, both consequentialists and people with more following more deontological moral systems should both prioritize the long-term view, or at least reducing existential risk. So I think that this trade-off, just in practice, does not occur in this situation.
Okay, I think I also have a sort of counter argument that sort of regards maybe long-termism being unnecessary. But it's kind of based on challenging some of the assumptions that were in Carlo's reading list, which he put together for us. So I'm questioning the assumption that human lives are valuable in the way that you put it. So I'm not going to claim that we have no value at all or anything like that, but I am going to offer a view about where this value comes from. And I'm going to argue that in the present day, all existing human lives aren't valued equally, and this has knock-on effects for the long-term consequences. So prospects for flourishing are as unequally distributed as wealth and education. Healthcare is distributed unequally. Safety is unequal and dependent on vulnerability, which is a creation of the political atmosphere of your location. On what basis are you declaring that the value of human lives is the same? And I know that's a question that I will continue for a bit. Hold on, Carlo. If we judge human value by looking at what properties of a person's life have value to that person, say, those attributes, security, health, happiness, freedom of movement, and increasingly freedom of thought, they are maybe never going to be at an equal level for all people. But there is an injustice in that they are not at a fair level when comparing lives. So currently, life value cannot be declared equal for all people on this basis, unless you're appealing to some well-wishing of equality that doesn't wholly manifest in reality. So when people say, well, maybe the human species doesn't really deserve to survive, it is likely coming from perceiving the injustice of humanity that in reality, human lives aren't equally valued. So whatever total quantity of happiness the species may collectively accrue, we want a future where human lives are valued fairly. Value of life for an individual, as I've suggested, depends on the levels of valuable properties of human life. And these value-laden properties are not entailed to be fairly distributed or protected simply by putting off extinction. Moreover, to say that most of human value exists in the future by adding up the value given by individuals completely disregards our crucial collective values, such as fairness, which are not guaranteed by long-termism or taken into account by this adding up of individual values. So if you assume that all lives are of equal value, rather than that these lives should be of equal value, then you are masking the difference in valuable properties of people's lives, and you are at risk of proliferating injustice. So I guess my first question to Carlo and Joar is, what basis of moral worth are you appealing to when you say all human lives are equal, and how is it more real or important than what I just offered?
It makes the maths a bit easier if you just assume that future lives are morally as valuable as lives in the present. It just makes multiplications easier, and you don't want to add extra assumptions by saying, oh, it should be 0.2% as valuable or something. Right? Even if you want to discount these future lives, I can't see any justification for that. If you want to say, oh, maybe they're human lives aren't worth the same. Maybe these particular lives are worth, 40%, right? Because you're multiplying it by such an astronomical figure, it really doesn't matter for the argument what you multiply it by, as long as it's like a sensible non-zero amount. Multiplied by 10 to the 70, it's just going to get washed out. So you'd have to. So it's not. You don't need to think that future lives are worth the same as present life. You just need to think they're not worth less than a quadrillionth, and that seems quite important.
So the point more is that the emphasis shouldn't necessarily be on like the total of whatever positive value in the future. It perhaps should be on what we value as like a species, including something like fairness, which long-termism doesn't really take into account. It's like these collective values rather than the adding up of values in an individual person's life.
So we argued for mitigating extinction on this kind of utilitarian aggregative grounds, right? But
Tracy, do you have something to say?
No, I was just gonna add something onto that, but like if you want to answer first, go for it.
Many people wanting to make inputs, it seems, so we'll have to,
Okay.
So we've made the case on this kind of aggregative utilitarian grounds, because that's the kind of quickest case to make. But even if you have a different view of policy, maybe we should make policy which is like fair and just. I think that would still lead to the same.
Yes, I think there are two things to say here. So first of all, let's say that you care about, and this is maybe not a fair construal of the point you're making, but let's say that you care about something like the average human having a fair life, or something like the least fortunate human being well off, things like this. Well, just because of the fact that there's a lot of humans in the future, if you want to improve the average well-being of a human, or the average justice a person experience in their life over the lifespan of the universe, that will still give a very almost all of the weight will go on improving the future. Now, in that case, you might not necessarily care about reducing existential risk, but the future will still carry most of the weight, so to speak. And then if the concern is a more like deontological thing, which is something like, well, we always have a duty to take actions that are in accordance with justice or something like this, then well, two things. First of all, then the recommendation might just be to take the most just actions that reduce existential risk or something like that. So again, in moral philosophy, you will sometimes distinguish between axiology, which is sort of the value of a situation, and deontology, which is what you should do. And even most deontological systems that I think are more popular now, but I'm not an expert on this, are sensitive to axiological concerns, even if they don't think necessarily that the action you should do is just what improves axiology the most. But basically, deontological systems tend to start looking more consequentialist as the stakes get bigger. And in this case, the stakes are truly astronomical indeed. But I'm not sure if this precisely answers your question.
I'm not sure either.
Alice,
do you have something to say? And then we'll go to Tracy.
All right.
Shruti can go first, because she...
Okay. I suppose I like this relates to Ashley's question. It's just this idea of like long-termism, me caring about like, a potential future because this many human lives are at stake. I just think that like, are those human lives, I suppose you sort of like were talking about this, are those human lives and something that I'm supposed to base this value on, like why I should care about this human life is also to do with the fact that, so that we can multiply the joyousness of being human. And I suppose it's just that I mean, I could make a fairly convincing argument that most people alive today aren't very joyous. And I like, what is, is there any reason why we should think that they will have cause to be more joyous in the future, and somehow like a more just society will come about? Because I think you also mentioned this idea of like, like colonization of space and like, other areas, because this planet itself will not be able to support that many lives anyway. Who will have access to that? The inequalities that exist today will manifest like in the long term. And I suppose that maybe a better argument would be to actually, like, maybe a better argument for long-termism would be to actually like solve the problems that we have in the short term, so that we can even hope for a better future, than think about existential risks to human population.
So if you had the option to just kill a random person living today, would you do that? There's a button, you can press it, a random person alive today will die.
Like, why would I, like, I mean, why would I have any reason to kill someone?
Right, so you do value human lives, right? If I said, would you rather, you press the button and then you get £100, would you press it?
No, of course not.
Right, so you
Carlo,
do value...
I'm really confused by your little thought experiment here.
He might be getting
Well, she was like, oh, we don't, these lives aren't joyous and therefore worth saving. But
No. That was not my point. My point was that they're not joy. That is the premise of your argument, that human life contains joy, and that is reason enough for us to.
No, that wasn't a premise. The premise was human lives are valuable, right? And
valuable.
You believe
why?
they're also valuable because you would rather save a human life than get £100, right? So you also believe they're valuable. It's not the joyous wasn't an assumption, right? I'm appealing to what you yourself want, right?
I mean, I guess we do make the assumption that the lives of future people are not so wretched that they're not worth living. But I think that is probably a fairly plausible assumption, especially if we...
How is that a fairly plausible assumption if most of the population alive today aren't living lives that are, like, I mean, not that they aren't valuable, those lives are still valuable. It's just that those people, like majority of human population living today don't have access to clean water, food, basic necessities.
Yeah,
the majority.
So I think one thing to keep in mind is that if we take a large perspective view of human history, the trend is for things to get better.
No. I don't. That is a complete misconception. Since when? Where?
Shruti a historian. I'm gonna put.
Wait, so you said the majority of the population right now don't have access to clean drinking water?
Yeah.
That's not true.
Yeah, it is.
The majority?
Yeah.
There are 3.5 billion people who don't have access to clean drinking water. That's just not true.
I think it's fairly true. I think, like, I mean,
it's less than a billion. It's less than a billion. And, in the 80s, that might have been true, right? So,
yeah, so, I have, here is just some example statistics from the internet. So over the past 10 years, extreme poverty went down from 18.2% to 8.6%. Global life expectancy increased by 3 years. The share of countries with laws protecting women from violent partners increased from 53% to 78%. Most rich countries consume less material goods than before. And the amount of people living in countries classified as not free by Freedom House data has gone down from 34% to 26%. And yeah, I think, especially, I mean, if we look, if we go back like 500 years in history, almost everyone was just a subsistence farmer, living in totalitarian state. Well, not exactly totalitarian because they just didn't really have the technology to do that, but they lived in dictatorships. Human rights didn't really exist.
Okay, thank you. Can we hear from Alice, please?
All right.
Thanks. This is kind of intersecting, I guess, like two things that have come up. Kind of to do with the structure of the argument and also with like concerns about assumptions that have been raised, because I don't think they're separate. I'm curious, right? So like when you give this data, because it's the data we have, that is being gathered by certain people, and we know that things like gender data gaps are like, and not just gender data gaps, that's one term, are like very real things that go on to have detrimental effects as well on people, such like the healthcare illusions that Ashley made and things like that. And that's just one example. And even within like the way we're talking about this argument, and it doesn't mean to say that potentially the argumentative structure is wrong, but perhaps it might be more useful to use other terms, which obviously might change the argument itself. But when you say like under prioritized, that's different than like under discussed, because maybe a lot of things need to be quote unquote prioritized, but then maybe we don't really call them all priorities anymore. And relating back to the gender data gap part, it seems like the structure of the argument looking forward to long-termism, well, like technically, right, there's not really a single present moment. So like everything is the future. So it's if we've got an infinite future versus segmented futures. So I would be interested when people are talking about long-term versus short-term things, how they're segmenting those things up to count and like thinking about them. Because at the same time as you have like this infinite future, there's a Buddhist argument in the Bodhicharya by Shantideva, which talks about, right, like not just looking to the future, but looking to all the current like lives at the same time, not just the current lives at the same time, but all the sentient beings at the same time. And however you want to think about that is like my hand, a different sentience to my head or whatever. So just like the arguments that apply to the future apply equally to the present, but if it's not a present, it goes to this segmentation. And so that might kind of like blur some of the tensions there. But if you have a set group of people making determinations of like what the values are and what we're valuing, not just that there is a value to human life or sentient life, or however we want to frame that argument, my concern would be like who's making those decisions. And I think that's partly what Ashley and Shruti were expressing as well, because that will be what gets prioritized within the prioritizing conversation. So I'm curious, like,
a
how
few
you
things.
think about that.
A few things to say. Can I start, Carlo?
Yeah.
Okay. So first, I don't think that exactly when you consider the future, quote unquote, to begin doesn't matter so much for this argument. It goes through similarly anyway. So for example, we could suppose that, yeah, the future is just everything that happens from the year 3000 to the end of the universe. Yeah. And that would make the argument work roughly.
And there's going to be a nice point at which the likelihood of us killing ourselves is going to drop.
Yeah, basically go to zero.
And so we could, as long as we get to that point, like you're kind of safe, at least from, you know, natural risk and nuclear war. And
yeah.
So like,
and then
we could
the second
that.
thing, yeah. the second thing, which Carlo also pointed out earlier, and I very much want to stress, is that this argument is quite invariant of your actual values, right? So, for example, even if you suppose that, I'm not familiar with the exact argument that you're giving here, but let's say that my hand has a separate sentience from my head, and etc. Well, still there will be many more hands in the future, probably. So just
well, so
by the quantities we're dealing with, yeah.
The different, I think this would change it, and saying that it doesn't matter what your values are wouldn't not change it, would not change it. Would be like, say, the Buddhist argument is not a positive assertion, it's a negative assertion. So they want to end suffering. It's not like we want more happiness. And I think that makes a difference.
Yes. So one difference, if you are, for example, a negative utilitarian, and it seems to me like this would also be a consequence of Buddhism, that if you just want to, if you think existence is suffering and you want to end suffering, then the extinction of the human species would be great, right? Because you can't have any suffering if you don't have any people. And yeah, if you start out from those moral premises, then the argument is flipped. Then you have an overwhelming moral obligation to ensure that the human species goes extinct. But say that for some reason you still don't want to do this. Maybe, for example, if you, so probably you're not 100% confident that your views of ethics are correct. So this means that when you take actions, you ideally want them to be sort of compatible with many moral systems. And I think from this perspective, you still, even if you were to put high confidence in negative utilitarianism or some Buddhist philosophies, I think you should still find yourself hesitant to try to bring about the extinction of the human species, given that that's something that would be very, very bad according to some moral systems. And even if you just want to, again, sort of reduce suffering in general or improve average human life quality, the future still just gets all of the weight, essentially, in the calculation. Now, I think another thing which is coming up in some of the responses here is something like, well, so probably we want to ensure that it's not just about making sure that the future happens, but also to make sure that lives in the future are better. So for example, we don't want, so let's say that there is just some objectionable political ideology that is popular on Earth in the early 21st century. We wouldn't want this ideology to then just spread over the universe and just kind of consolidate where it then couldn't be gotten rid of. And I think that this is also something that could be accommodated within the long-termist view. The reason that it tends to be emphasized less is basically because reducing existential risk is seems like a very robustly good thing. Whereas politics, first of all, it's more difficult to do because a lot of people are trying to have political influence. So just the difference that one individual person could make in a sphere of politics isn't that significant, even if you knew exactly what to do. Whereas if you look at something like reducing existential risk, because this is just not something particularly many people work on, your ability to have a higher marginal impact is just much more significant. And then secondly, even ignoring the fact that it's just very difficult to affect political change, it's also very difficult to predict what political change is positive or negative, right? Because society is just a very, very complex structure, and predicting how things will interact there is tricky. I don't know if there would be much in a point in giving like specific examples, but I'm sure you can easily think of them. Yeah.
So like long-termism seems to be able to like encompass like a whole bunch of queries that we bring up. And I think that's kind of down to long-termism not really being that relevant to a good future. And it's kind of because it's not really necessary or sufficient for a good future by anyone's terms. And if you don't have a good future, you don't really care about the long-termist perspective, because if it's not going to be good what's in the future, then you don't want it to be preserved and continued. So does anyone have any does anyone else have any questions or anything they want to say?
There are a lot of
wait,
on the side.
Can we go to Kieran and then we'll go to Shruti?
Hi, thanks. Yeah, just a couple of quick points. Ashley, in response to your original point, I'm sorry if I'm getting it wrong. It seems like you're talking about the value of fairness, communal values, things that are realized not in a person, but only in a society as a whole. Seems very reasonable. To me, I'd want to make 2 points to that, one specific and one general. When it comes to fairness, it seems to me that fairness can exist not just within a generation, but between generations. And if you take an intergenerational fairness perspective, again, that seems to support a long-termist position. I mean, it seems unfair to leave people without a world to live in, right? Or a world where they wouldn't be able to flourish properly. That kind of thing. The more general point is, if you think that these things are realized at communal level, that's fine. But it doesn't seem to me they're realized for all human life across the universe, at least not plausibly, because if you have separate colonized worlds that are not partaking in economic relations with each other, it's plausible to me that fairness, you don't have a fairness concern, not of the standard kind, if they have different levels of wealth. You know, one of the reasons we care about fairness in society is we have ongoing relational inequalities with each other, which wouldn't be the case here. You might still care about it, some egalitarian positions I'm sure would, but it's not obvious to me that's the case, and that some of those communal values could be realized in very many disparate, non-connected worlds. And then also just to say, in response to something Joar said, it's not clear to me we need to rely on Whig historiography, but yeah, Anyway, that was all I had to say.
Cool, thanks, Kieran. I don't think that like the long-term perspective kind of like, I don't think it's sufficient for really, well, at least the argument that's presented, it's not really sufficient for like encompassing all of these different sort of outcomes and aspects to like what the future entails. It sort of seems that this particular argument for long-termism like focuses on like the values that an individual person has in their life. Like you count up the happiness or whatever good value that all of these people have, whereas there's more to humanity than that, which isn't encompassed into this long-term argument. And those things are that like humanity as a whole has like properties and values that aren't just a sum of each individual's like value.
Yeah,
and
so,
that's what I
want
think
to stress.
long-termism doesn't really take into account. But could we just go to Shruti?
Okay.
Like you said, sort of picking up on this idea that you said, like it's very hard to predict what society is going to look like, or you know, politics. I think that like then it brings into question like what we actually value. Like, you know, like through the long-termist argument, is it just human life for human life's sake, or is it the fact that, you know, there's hope for a better society, maybe a more just society, maybe like a more flourishing society in some way? Because if there's a chance that actually the long-term argument, like, you know, in the long term, human society just ends up being, you know, genocidal and colonial, I mean, you know, which it has been in the past historically, then like, you know, and only increases human suffering. Like, is that like, I mean, like, even if there's a chance of that, should we take that chance?
So is the argument something like we should be most concerned about preventing bad things from happening, more so than maybe trying to make good things happen? And if we do this, then it still seems to me like you get a conclusion that trying to prevent bad things from happening in the future has a much higher weight than trying to prevent bad things from happening in the present. Yeah, and even then, I mean, you could argue, it depends a little bit on how exactly you spell out the moral views, but arguably everyone in the future not even existing could be construed as the ultimate genocide, but you might not want to count them if they don't yet exist, etc., etc. It depends, yeah, on how you set up things formally.
Okay, so we've got a question from Luca.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there might be sort of a logical problem in the long-termism approach, because if this generation now thinks, well, there's potentially an infinite amount of other generations coming, so my moral choices should be the ones that optimize all their experience.
I think you dropped out. I can't hear you now.
Yeah, I didn't catch that.
I think you dropped out. Could you repeat the last 10 seconds, maybe?
Okay, yeah, sure. So I think if you don't really have like a clear endpoint towards which you can maximize, then you always will have the situation that there's potentially infinite amount of future generations coming. So do you have a sort of utility procrastination almost? Like,
yes.
Yeah, I don't know how that would work.
Well, so yes, infinite ethics, very tricky topic. Fortunately, the laws of physics turn out to be such that there will be a heat death of the universe at some point, which means that there is...
Unfortunate.
Yeah, unfortunately for the future, fortunately for just the convenience of our calculations, there is in fact an absolute endpoint on the scale on which you can do these calculations. Likewise, with finite speed of light means that we could never get our hands on an infinite amount of resources, things like this, which means that no, you don't actually have to run into all of these paradoxes with infinite utility, probably.
So what does that mean? What does the heat death of the universe mean? How is that a meaningful endpoint? Can you just explain?
So there's no free entropy for you to exploit in order to make, well, for like chemical reactions to happen.
Yeah, so it's
or
like
the
when all
computations in a
energy
computer.
is kind
So
of
the entire universe
nothing can
is
happen.
a very homogeneous sea of low-level light radiation.
Yeah, eventually
so
the entire universe will just be a sea of lukewarm gas in which nothing can happen, regardless of what we do, because of how entropy works. And
Okay,
at that
cool.
point, we can stop the calculations, I think.
Could I quickly respond, because I think that doesn't work, or at least like it makes the theory self-defeating. Because if that's quite far away, then for almost all generations before the heat death until like the very last few, your argument that there's still future generations for which should be optimized still works. That you'd have potentially a vast mountain of generations that forego sort of cashing in their utility for future generations, and just the very last few get their utility.
Yeah, so it might be that actually for quite a while, people will still just prioritize improving the future, but then those last couple of generations will have, you know, a great time. Like because like computing the integral will be like well defined. There will be a set of actions that maximizes its value and so on.
But generations now can't compute it because they don't know when the heat death will be. I mean, like if you have, let's say you have 10 million of generations that just forgo utility, right?
So
then you might have
my question,
100 last ones.
my question to you and Carlo wasn't what is the heat death of the universe. It was more, can you explain how that's relevant? To what extent does it actually have some kind of meaningful end to this long-term?
So one of the
it's like we can no longer affect things beyond that point. And we definitely know that probably, like, for most value systems, what happens at that point has no value, which means that we can just think of this as a stopping point eventually, effectively. It's like if, I mean, imagine that you're floating in space on like this little area that you can do things to, and you can't exit the area, and there's nothing outside the area. Well, even if there's like an infinite void surrounding you, you can effectively think of the universe as being just confined to this finite area that you can interact with.
Can we hear from Alice?
Mm-hmm.
This is more of a question about how this theory contends with like other cosmologies, because like obviously it's talking within like a scientific framework, but the world that it exists within exists with people who believe in like life after death, or like that's just one example, right? Like there's like the Indian cosmology, and then like that's just because that's what I study, but like if they're going to take the world in a very different way, how are you going to communicate in a world where you all have to work together supposedly on this framework, and have just different cosmologies that aren't functioning on those like within that framework, and yet it's meant to account for those people as well? And so I'm just wondering how that works on a practical level, like how you would talk to someone about that. It, like given, because then like this endpoint of the universe would have a different meaning. Like it might not be an issue, but then the whole argument might not be an issue. So we're just assuming that someone has to enter into this argument on those terms, or how would you, or do those terms hold with a bit of flexibility in belief systems?
So in terms of different eschatologies across religions,
or cosmologies as well, but eschatologies works too.
Yeah, so for example, in Christianity, I think the idea is that like if you conceive more babies, then like new souls are created. And so on that eschatology, there's going to be more souls in heaven at the end of it.
I mean, I'm less concerned with Christianity because I think there's a lot of discourse, because this tends to be a pretty Western conversation. Like I study this in philosophy of religion, but philosophy of religion is Christianity. But I'm worried, and I think some of these concerns were raised, but I'm also curious, like how you would, with others.
As applied to Hinduism, I'm not sure what, if the population increases, I'm not sure how that, how they make that consistent with ideas of reincarnation, of like a fixed stock of souls.
Well, it depends what Hinduism.
But you know, I don't know. Maybe as the population increases under Hinduism, more souls are created in order to fill up these vessels. In which case, you know, long-termism still holds. Maybe that, you know, these vessels just go without souls, and no more worth, in which case...
Well, for a lot of Indian systems, this is just throwing in, it's not just an axiology, it's a kinesiology. So a change in knowledge would just mean that this like reality that we're talking in didn't exist on a metaphysical level. So that just like changes things. And so I'm just, you know, like, how would you talk to someone about this who thought that way? Because that exists in this world that you think you're talking about. So that clearly matters.
So, I mean,
okay, I'm going to give
your religious affiliation.
Sorry, Carlo, can you hold on?
Yeah.
I'll give you some time to think about what you're going to say, Carlo, just because it's been an hour since we started, and so if anyone needs to leave, then feel free. Now's your exit point, etc. We are probably going to finish up on this point. I can imagine a lot of people are unsatisfied with the discussion so far. I'm not sure if, for example, Luke is satisfied with his argument regarding the logic, and so maybe we will continue for a while, but we will also we should probably like stop recording at some point as well too. So I think we'll let Carlo finish this, then we'll have some concluding statements, finish the recording, and then we can discuss if anyone is unsatisfied enough to continue talking to each other. Cool. All right. Bear that in mind, Carlo.
So on the question of, you know, on a one-to-one basis, how would you convince someone with very different worldview of the case? What I would start with is finding out what they value, and what's probably going to be the case is that most of that value requires flourishing human existence, and that's all we need, right, for the case, right? Now there are, you know, the reason I'm quite confident that's going to be the case is that if you valued, if you didn't value flourishing human life, then you'd go around, you know, murdering people or something, which most people don't do.
Yeah.
So you'd have a good chunk of people convinced of the case, and I know they'd be convinced because they're not currently trying to cause.
Yeah, I mean, I think we could. So I guess there are two things to distinguish between here. Like, so first of all is how do you make this case to people with different moral systems?
Yeah.
And then the second question is how do you make the case to people whose kind of views and just the mechanics of the universe are very different. And those are going to have slightly different answers. I think for the first question, yeah, as Carlo says, I mean, even if we make up some, you know, like ridiculous value system, like let's say that you're someone who wants a lot of pencils to exist. Well, probably more pencils are going to exist in the future. So even if you just make up some value system, probably it's still going to be the case, according to this value system, that the future just has a very significant weight. Now, if we instead consider someone who just has a different view on the kind of mechanics of the universe, which is to say just the consequences of different actions, well, that's going to depend on their particular views. I don't think that there's any general answer. I mean, if we imagine someone who thinks that the world will definitely end in 10 years, I can't make a long-termist argument to them other than by convincing them that they're wrong. And then for other specific systems, yeah, it depends.
Could I clarify?
So to add on to Joar, even if you think, even if the person, this imaginary person you're talking to, even if they think, you know, it's really likely that the world descriptively looks like this rather than this, as long as they're uncertain about that kind of scientific opinion or cosmological opinion, you can still make the case that you're going to reduce the credence in extinction. Is still a good thing, right? So if someone thought there was a 50% chance that the world was definitely going to end in 5 years, right? You can still make the long-termist argument.
Yeah, their arguments might still be sort of affected significantly by what they think would happen if the world turns out not to end. So even if you have some sort of some reasonably high credence that these views of physics and so on are correct, that could be sufficient to give the argument weight. Does this cover the exact question, or did you?
So is the response kind of mainly that we would rely on the laws of physics?
Yeah, or at least if you have someone who.
Because that's not incompatible with like some of these systems. It's just like they have different sociological goals, and long-termism sounds sociological as well. But
to
it's
some
just saying
extent,
it.
yeah.
It's sociological, not in a Christian sense, just like about saving people, having a good life.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so if we look at just pure value systems, under most value systems, the long-termist argument does go through. There are some exceptions, but I don't think they have many adherents all in all.
So most groups throughout society have had value systems which require flourishing human life. There are some exceptions where like the sole aim of this group is to like annihilate this other group or something, but they're quite rare. Most of them, you know, might do terrible things, but their kind of end goal is maybe their own self-preservation or something.
Yeah, I mean, it's like the two views I think which would significantly alter your actions in this case are negative consequentialism, where you care about eradicating suffering, but you don't care about anything else. Then that will cause you to behave slightly differently. And the second one is if you have a so-called person-affecting view of population ethics, where you think basically that in order for a situation to be worse than the current situation, there must be either someone in that situation who is not well off, or a currently existing person who's not well off. And under this view, everyone going extinct and the universe just being dead for the rest of eternity would be morally neutral. But yeah, if you don't, basically according to most value systems, the argument does go through in one way or another.
Thanks. So just like, if I can make that distinction, because that seems more on par with like what Ashley and Trudy were saying, more on par, not necessarily the same. And then so your response to kind of like my question is laws of physics is because that's what you're using to argue for it, and you think those are convincing in themselves, and it might not be completely incompatible with another metaphysical worldview.
Yeah.
And then B, you think values fit into that. But my only remaining concern is like the values might not translate between systems, but then you'd rely on physics. My main question was like if it was set up to account for the different lives that it purports to speak for. So that's how I would do it. Thanks.
Does anyone have any particular questions? Because yeah, the time for it to end has sort of like passed, but we can continue to discuss anyway. Because if not, yeah, wait.
I'm still confused about what makes long-termism as a theory, as far as I can make out, developed by people like Will MacAskill and Toby Ord. What makes it so innovative? I don't understand why it's different from consequentialism. I don't understand why like identifying that we live in the precipice is innovative. That I get that, but I just don't see why it is anything particularly interesting if, as you said, you're not willing to make big sacrifices now. Right.
Well, so I'm not necessarily saying that I'm not willing to make big sacrifices now. I'm saying that I don't think that there in practice are opportunities to make big sacrifices now for the future, which means that a consequentialist and a deontologist would behave roughly similarly. So I'm not necessarily. So I'm just saying that yeah, it's not kind of practically committed to an answer to that question. But then, so the second question is, how is this innovative compared to just consequentialism or something? Well, this is effectively an argument in like applied ethics, right? So if you ask someone, if you want to do good, what should you do? Most of them would probably not talk about, I don't know, ensuring that space colonization goes well. So that is the sense in which it's different. It leads to different practical recommendations. It's not really a distinct moral system as opposed to consequentialism or deontology.
It's innovative in the sense that it doesn't agree with prior intuitions you would have had. I don't, I mean,
that's just consequentialism, right?
Well, so I mean,
that's the whole point of consequentialism.
Well, yeah, but the fact that you accept consequentialism, there's still the further question of, okay, how do you actually then maximize expected utility? And this is an argument for how to do that, which
so
is non-obvious.
Is it more than consequentialism with a particular discount rate?
No. Well, I mean, it's not. So this is not. There's like a type difference between these two things. Like consequentialism is a meta-ethical theory about what sorts of things have value. Long-termism is a concrete argument about what you should do in a particular situation. I mean, similarly, we might ask, like, if you have some view on like ethics in medicine, for example, you could then ask, well, okay, but how is this different from consequentialism? And the answer is they're not really the same sorts of things. This is, yeah, an argument about how you should take your actions, which is not obvious from prior intuitions, or even obvious just if you accept consequentialism. So, for example, I mean, do you think, I don't know, John Stuart Mills or someone would have been very concerned about this? I don't know. I haven't read much about it, but yeah.
So, and I'm sorry to beat a dead horse a bit, but returning to my original example about sort of the degree of suffering, the quantity, if you will, of suffering necessary to create like the golden age of Athens, given that the suffering now no longer exists and the benefits do exist in quite tangible ways, would you say that's justified from our perspective? How would that relate to a long-termist outlook?
Well, I think that
because it's in the past, there's not really anything we can do to stop, the sacking of Menos.
Well, we can say whether we think it's good or bad.
Yeah, and that might affect
in the same way that we could say whether it happened now, it would be good or bad.
But I think this is a slightly
surely it's equally good or bad whether it happens now or 2,500 years ago.
Yes. So we can make claims about whether things that happened in the past were good or bad. Absolutely. I'm just saying that I think that this is a slightly orthogonal issue in that it's in practice not something you have to decide.
So normally,
but are there trade-offs painful which do exist?
Not that I'm aware of.
Are there any examples of where this trade-off would happen? Like I get that short-term costs might be like you have to increase.
I think dealing like okay, climate change isn't an existential risk, but yeah. So I think there are almost no circumstances under which climate change is an existential.
Toby gives it a 1 in 1,000 roughly, I think. So
yeah, I read the book, but
it is a risk. Yeah, it is a risk. But I don't see like.
But there are all sorts of scenarios whereby like halting climate change creates massive short-term human cost.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, there's some solutions that's going to be the case, right? So one solution of stopping climate change is just like, burying everyone alive under the ground, right? And that isn't something I would recommend. There are.
I would call that a straw man.
Saying there are particular methods of stopping this risk, which I wouldn't recommend because of the suffering. Luckily, there are methods which don't cause any significant suffering and just like are just as good. So it doesn't matter whether
if it doesn't cause significant suffering, why do we need a long-termist argument to justify it? Surely that would be just as justified under consequentialist, like basic.
Well, I think you can have lots of cases.
So we're not making the claim that this is like something that you could just uniquely arrive at. I mean, in fact, we're making the opposite claim, right? For many different moral systems, this is something that you should be doing. And what makes this significant is that, yeah, if you look at the amount of people working on reducing existential risk, for example, it's a few hundred, as compared to, I mean, many other causes for how to improve the world.
So
it clearly is a recommendation that is not salient.
It feels to me, sorry, so I feel like I've figured this out a bit. It feels to me like long-term risk in this whole paradigm is about, it could be equally solved by like feeding these new inputs in terms of the awareness about existential risks into existing kind of moral functions. We don't actually need to develop our new system of morality. If we give these new, more accurate inputs in terms of being aware of the possibility of nuclear war or like AI or pandemics, if you feed that into existing working moral systems that govern the world today and political systems, then that should be enough. It doesn't really design us to redesign the functions.
Yes, I mean,
of those moral
right?
systems.
This is the.
So why is it a new moral system rather than just like a new set of inputs?
System. It's a question of applied ethics. So this, again, I want to stress, long-termism is not a moral system. It is a practical recommendation for how to do things in applied ethics. So as you say, yeah, this is an argument.
Do you want to explain that distinction for people who aren't necessarily?
So I'm not actually a philosopher.
So if you imagine someone's in surgery, right, on the hospital bed, right, and then the doctor turns to his assistant and says, you know, we should do this particular procedure, right? That requires two things. Firstly, we should save his life, and secondly, a kind of factual claim about the world that doing this procedure is going to like take this guy's life, right? And that's similar to the relation between, you know, this the case we're making now and the moral theory of aggregative consequentialism, right? What we're saying is, if you do these things, you're going to cause more value, and like that's what you should be doing. So it's to get, you know, the prescription. You have a factual claim about the world that we're making, like nuclear war is very possible right now, and then there's a moral claim which is like nuclear war is bad, right? And I think that's what's new, right? The kind of factual claim about the world that like the world is like far less stable than we think it is, and if we act well, there could be loads of human lives. That's what makes consequentialism in our case different.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense actually. Thank you.
So could we draw a line under that one? Are there any other loose ends that we'd like to cover before we close up? I'm still wondering when we want to close up. I'm surprised you've gone on an hour and 20 minutes. But I will check in every now and then to see where you guys do want to end.
To be honest, I'd kind of like to bang on about the one I was asking about earlier, if that's fine with people.
Yeah, let's go for it.
Sure. So even if you have the heat death of the universe as a theoretical endpoint, at least your theory still will be quite likely self-defeating. So if you take the premise now that in comparison to how many generations there will be, your concerns now are pretty irrelevant. You shouldn't really care about your utility. The same will be the case for generation after and for very, very long stretch of time with further generations, until you might have a generation that says, okay, well, the heat death of the universe might be quite close now, at which point probably none of us will exist anymore. But even if there were such a generation, then I don't know, perhaps 20 generations before that, people could start caring about looking after their own utility, at which point, since the universe is so, well, long time-wise, quite likely have like a billion generations that didn't care for their own utility at all, because there were always going to be more generations after themselves, and then maybe like 20 generations that are on the framework allowed to care about their own utility. So I would have quite a low sort of total utility outcome.
Well, so I think there are two things here. So first of all, if they do the calculations correctly, the total utility should be great, right? I mean, it might be that the recommendation you end up with is just that the human species should work very hard for trillions of years and then like retire at the very end or something, have a lot of fun, maybe. If that's the case, and the kind of total value then in fact is bigger, that's not clearly a bad outcome, as I see it. But then secondly, one thing we also have to take into account practically is just that your ability to significantly affect the future is much greater now than it will be in 1 million years or something, just because by then humanity is already like quite spread out and your things are just more robust, which means that later on sort of more immediate concerns should get a greater weight. But even if we ignore that, it's not clear to me that it would be a good thing for humanity to just harvest most of the value like at the end of time effectively.
Yeah, this is a very kind of narrow period in human history. It's not like this is what we're going to prescribe for every subsequent generation, right? It's just for
so I mean, if I could
right
somehow,
now, for people
if
in
I
this
could,
Zoom chat, and that's it.
If I could somehow now make like a more, so let's say I had a time machine and I could speak with someone in ancient Rome. My recommendation to them wouldn't be think about nuclear weapons because they can't like do anything about that. I would tell them like, well, maybe look into like slavery and try to get rid of that, things like that. So we are making, one relevant detail here is that we think that the time period in which these things are truly at stake is not so long. So that is also something to keep in mind.
That needs a very, very difficult premise though, which is that there won't be extinction events possible within a few generations, right?
Or at least that they would be much less likely. So if we plot like risk of extinction over time, we could imagine that it would look something like that. I mean, I don't want to make the claim that extinction will be absolutely impossible in 1 million years. That seems like a very demanding claim to make. But I do think it would be very, very plausible to argue that at least it would be much more difficult for mankind to go extinct at that stage.
Why?
Well, because right now we have a situation in which, if, so we have been close to nuclear war several times because there have been situations in which just like computer systems in the United States or the USSR have malfunctioned. So there has been, I think, at least 2 situations where in the Soviet Union, their computer systems told them that a nuclear strike was coming and they just decided not to act on it or whatever. And it turned out that it was just a software bug. Similarly, I mean, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, there was also a situation where some submarine lost contact with Moscow, and the higher ups in command, I believe, wanted to carry out a nuclear strike, and then someone further down the ladder just stopped this. So we're in a situation where like individual events could destroy the universe or the humanity at least, and then sort of by extension much of the universe. And likewise with reckless use of artificial intelligence or other kinds of technologies, or potentially like very aggressive climate change. Whereas if let's say that we're spread out over a few galaxies where there are several light years between the stars, it's like the influence of individual events just doesn't sort of reach far. First of all, just the kind of the causal output of an event just doesn't reach far enough to reach all of this at once. And just have so many individual communities or systems just makes the entire thing more robust. That it's very difficult to conceive of an accident or an intentional act that destroy such a system.
Can we hear from Charlie?
Yeah, Charlie.
Yeah, I was trying to avoid making this point earlier when we were talking about moral values and like axiomatic stuff, but at a more pragmatic point, you can imagine someone in like Anglo-Saxon times saying, we don't have to worry about one tribe wiping out another tribe. Like if there are tribes all around the world, then one tribe can only wipe out one other tribe, right? And so it's fine. We're not all going to go extinct because we're all spread out. But they didn't see that there were going to be like intercontinental like nuclear weapons that could just blow everyone up. Okay, so we think right now there isn't going to be any future technology that could be weaponized appropriately. But if you have like theoretically, you could have a sort of self-replicating virus like space virus with computerized that takes over worlds and like moves around. So your argument is that humanity's area can grow like sort of cubically, possibly up to the speed of light in every direction, or is it? I don't know the maths, but still, a virus, like a computerized virus, could do exactly the same thing, right?
Yeah. So I'm not necessarily. I don't want to make the claim that it will be completely impossible for humanity to go extinct in 1 million years. Like you could imagine just some kind of super being that just like grabs matter and I don't know, creates some kind of unstoppable army to destroy everything. I'm just saying I think that it's less likely. It will be more difficult. I think that the world now is much more sort of fragile than it will be at that point. And I think that is an extremely plausible claim.
I don't think the response to Luca requires that though either. I just think that you would expect that over time, like it doesn't have to be a step change of right now I care about it, later I don't.
Yeah, it does not have to be like a discrete
I care
thing.
less. And also not all of my decisions I have to like depend on that. Like when I decide what cereal to have for breakfast, right? Neither decision is going to help the universe that much more, like the long-term future.
Yeah.
So I could just have the nicer cereal and then enjoy that more. And you're still getting value even if my overall concern is for the long-term future.
Yeah. So like not every action like affects this, like, or at least not in a way that we can reliably compute.
Yeah. So for decisions like which cereal I should eat, I would say just eat which cereal you want. Don't even think about long-termism. But when you've got say like billions of pounds, right, and you've got teams of academics who can like go and research the best way to spend it. Like maybe just in those types of decisions, you should bother thinking about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think even
all career choice, right?
Yes, so I think even at a point like career choice, or if you want to donate money to charities, that it does come in relevant for those kinds of things. But for these like micro decisions, like what should I eat today? I don't think just the effort of computing the impact of that would just like cancel out any potential benefit you could have. Like,
and also that is a problem that will affect any ethical theory, right? So Kant, isn't going to apply his deontology to eating cereal. Kind of any ethical theory.
Kant was
basically
a strange person, but
yeah. It's not a unique problem for like consequentialism or long-termism, because any ethical theory has to be like, how much should I think about this?
Yeah, like it's more important to save your brain power for the bigger decisions.
Okay, cool.
Also, one thing okay. I do want to point out, actually, which I think I should have pointed out earlier, but well, at least if I can, better late than never, I suppose. So just a very relevant question is how big is actually the risk that humanity goes extinct in the next few hundred years? Obviously, this is very difficult to compute. A bunch of people have had a go at it, and they reach kind of different numbers. But the numbers they reach tend to be on the lower end about 1%, and on the higher end something like 20%. So, there's a lot of uncertainty, but that's the kind of range we're talking about. And those are very big numbers, right? If, I mean, even just on a personal level, like, would I take a pill that has a 1% chance of killing me? No, I wouldn't. And if you now imagine like a pill that has a 1% chance of just destroying everything in existence and the future, would I take that? No, even less so. And like, yeah. So the numbers are also like big even in that direction.
But also, it doesn't really matter what the exact figure is, because when you multiply it by the astronomical figure, 1% and 14% basically have the same effect, right? You still get
like even like
this
like 10 to the 33 zeros or whatever, or like 10 to the you can shave off a lot of orders of magnitude, and it will still be as larger than everything else. So yeah, it does not. It's not super sensitive to this, but I still think it's worth pointing out that the probabilities we're dealing with are also uncomfortably high.
Numbers get really big. Okay, so it's been an hour and a half. I think we should have a concluding response from both you and Carlo. Discussion's kind of like gone through quite a lot of different paths. We've had discussions about, you know, whether human lives are valued in the correct way through this thinking. We've had discussions about the logic of the heat death universe, and also where this like precipice moment comes into all of that, as well as like various sorts of ins and outs. Would Joar and Carlo care to give the listeners or viewers a much better summary than I just did?
Yes, I could make my summary of the argument thusly. We are gambling astronomical stakes, and you should keep this in mind when making any kinds of decisions that could affect how things turn out, more or less regardless of what your values are, especially if you're uncertain about which moral systems are correct and so on. Yes.
Great. Carlo?
So what I'd like to add is what I would like to add is that all the fruit is very low hanging. And so, you know, if there were cases where there's these trade-offs with like causing huge suffering for short term, for like maybe a lot of suffering in the future, if those were the, you know, the order of the day, then I'd have a much more difficult case. But because there's so much we can do, which is neutral or beneficial in the short term, and like astronomically good in the future, we should just focus on those, right? Because the trade-offs aren't like, you know, kill 1 billion people now and, you know, reduce extinction. It's stuff like, you know, help climate change, right? That's only going to help people today, right? They're going to stop choking on pollution and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean, like,
so,
reduce risk of nuclear war, better like prevention of, or like, better safety mechanisms against pandemics, as should be salient now. We don't have very good mechanisms for that.
So
like, yeah.
What I'd say is that even if you aren't 100% convinced, right? If you're, you know, I'm not 100% convinced, right? Maybe I'm 8%, maybe I'm 20% something else, right? But what I do is I try and act in ways which are consistent with all these kind of moral principles. And naturally, that's not as difficult as you think, right? Because they overlap on a lot of really practical solutions that you can do in, you know, your individual life. You know, so that's what I'd say.
Lovely. Thank you for that, Carlo and Joar. It's been a pleasure to have you for this. I am just going to stop the recording. We can continue to hang out here if you'd like. I hope that people listening choose to join us live for one of these, because it's a lot more fun when you get to shape where the discussion is going. So yeah, thank you for tuning in. See you next time.